In today's video, we'll be looking at the first play from the guards in Meyer's longsword system. This first play is executed from the high guard, otherwise known as Tag, which translates variously to day or roof, whichever you prefer. It's quite a long play with several parts, so let's take a look at the entire thing before we disassemble it. Beginning in the high guard, we respond to an opponent's attack, stepping out and counterattacking with the flat. We cut around to the exposed lower right opening with the true edge, before stepping back and attacking the upper left opening with a deep Furhow. As the opponent responds, we flow off, cross our hands and cut to the upper right opening, before withdrawing to safety with another Furhow. As with many of Meyer's plays, this is quite an extended sequence of attacks and defences, so let's break it down piece by piece, beginning with the high guard. Meyer describes the guard position as shown in this illustration. However, in practice, we do see a great deal of variety in how the guard is formed. From the conventional high tag, where the hands are more or less central and directly overhead, we can move the hands to the right, ready for a deep cutting action. We can also drop closer to the shoulder, for a more commonly used shoulder tag. In competition, this drops down even further, so the blade itself is resting on the shoulder. And sometimes there's a slight twist of the torso into something akin to the posta di donna from Furhow's system, which lies somewhere between a shoulder tag and Meyer's Zornhut. In all cases, it's important that the lead elbow be slightly forward and the rear hand be structured behind the blade ready to cut. If we hold the blade too high overhead and widen those elbows out, we lose all cutting structure and ability to move quickly. Similarly, we shouldn't hang the sword too far behind our head. This risks the crossguard actually hitting our head in the cutting action, which, from personal experience, is deeply unpleasant. Brilliant, now we're ready to go. All we need to do is enter our newly learned high guard, move around in the fight, and counterattack, right?
Wrong.
As usual, things are never quite as simple as they seem. Consider the following scenario. We wish to use our newly learned high guard to attack our opponent. So we have to come up into the high guard, and of course we have to enter into distance. This is incredibly dangerous. The lead foot step forward cue with this open guard position risks a direct attack against us as we step into the danger zone. Let's consider what Vigiani, another author from the same period, would say about this sort of guard position.
You are flawed and imperfect.
Imperfect. Harsh. Now we have 4 basic guards in the German system: Tag, Ochs, Alba and Pflug. These are characterized by being high or low and being point online or point offline. Tag is high and offline. Vigiani calls these offline guard positions imperfect because they present no threat of the point to the opponent and don't prevent them entering towards us. By contrast, guards which are held on point are perfect because they threaten with the point and provide immediate defense. So this leaves us with something of a dilemma. Both Vigiani and Meyer use these offline guard positions in attack, so how do we offset their imperfection? One possible answer can be found in the very first sentence of this play from Meyer. And firstly, when you come before your opponent and have come up in the air with your sword by slashing up. When Meyer's talking about slashing up, he's talking about a false edge cut through Longpoint into the high guard. Notice, as we pass through Longpoint, we are actually in a perfect guard position. This on-point posture prevents our opponent from attacking us. They have to deal with the point if they don't want to be stabbed. This forces them to pause for a moment, giving us just enough time to come into high guard, ready for a counterattack. We still need to be cautious. It's entirely possible to step forward with the lead leg before we've fully swept into Longpoint. This undoes all of the benefits that the perfection of Longpoint offers. This danger of cueing the opponent with the lead foot is noted by Dall'Agocchi, as well as by other authors later into the 16th and 17th centuries. So how do we solve the problem? An effective method is to glide forward, transitioning the body weight to the lead leg and gathering forward with the rear. This shifts our body forward slightly, closing the distance. The position allows us to immediately step back if necessary, in what Meyer calls a stolen step, or to continue the body weight shift forward into our passing step. This type of movement is a cornerstone of Meyer's side sword system, and we also see it in Vigiani, where these forward-weighted single-leg positions are quite clear. Even more striking is Agrippa, where we see weight transitions and closed foot positions into open steps, both described and clearly illustrated. When applied to Meyer's longsword, we can also add a slight opening of the hip at the entry position. We see this illustrated throughout his text, as you can see here in the Dusak, and it allows us to square our hips and shoulders, providing a more effective structure for our follow-up cut. From my point of view, this lesson of shifting and moving through Longpoint is one of the most important learning outcomes of the Targ plays. Another important outcome is the fact that we're not meant to linger for any length of time in the positions. In fact, it's very often the case that we won't make it up to the full extent of our high guard before having to execute our cut. This reduced size of guards is actually something people use intentionally in tournaments. It cuts down the speed of execution of a movement and reduces the window of opportunity for the opponent's attack. Meyer talks about this in his introductory section on fighting from the postures. We don't gather fully up all of the time, and we don't linger in any guard position, especially guard positions which are vulnerable, like the high guard. Instead, we just stay long enough to make the decision about whether to execute our attack or change our strategy. Finally, we don't just have to use Longpoint on this entry. We can also use other perfect guards. For example, we can come into Ox, which also threatens the point, before cutting around. Okay, we're nearly 6 minutes into the video and we haven't even gotten out of Targ yet. So what's next? Well, it wouldn't be Meyer without a cut with the flat. Before getting into why we're using the flat, let's look at the setup. This is actually a counterattack. Our opponent is ready to attack, we enter, and before they have a chance to cut at us, we cut in with the flat, preventing their attack, and if things have gone well, we simultaneously hit them with the tip of our sword. So of course, why are we using the flat? Here is the equivalent action, using the edge of the sword. After all, the edges are the sharp bit, so it does make sense. However, in a conventional cut, notice that we still have some exposure to the left hand, even to the lead hand, and to the areas behind the blade. We're using this as a counterattack, so we might not want to risk those exposures, particularly in a sporting context. If by contrast we use the flat of the blade, notice we get a different blade angulation and guard angulation. This effectively creates an area where we can catch the incoming cuts without risk to our hands, and without the opponent's blade being able to hit our exposures behind our own weapon. As an additional benefit, notice that the blade flexes along the flat. This is very useful in a sporting context, and is used historically, as we can see in this illustration from one of Meyer's earlier texts. In modern competition, it's extremely effective, and we can use it to land the point, as you can see here. The flex of the blade goes over the opponent's weapon, landing the point and scoring. In this example, I'm transitioning through Ox into Targ before flexing over with the point and hitting the rear shoulder. Of course, it doesn't always work. In this case, we miss entirely. I come up into Targ, attempt the flex, and it entirely misses, creating an ineffective attack. In this example, we use the slash up to beat the opponent's blade, and then use the attack with the flat to flex over and tag the mask. Having attacked with the flat, we now cut around to the lower opening at the hands and arms. This sequence of high to low across a diagonal opposite should be very familiar to anyone who's done Meyer before or watched my video on the Meyer square. It's exactly the same sequence. The concept here is that by attacking the upper left opening, we draw the parry and the opponent's sword comes up to defend themselves. Because the opponent's momentum and intention is going upwards to the side, the clearest opening is on the opposite diagonal. This is the furthest distance away from where their sword is, and so represents the longest distance possible for them to parry. Counterattack to draw their parry, cut around to their arms. Let's see it in practice. We draw the parry, we cut around. It happens very quickly, and if done properly, doesn't give the opponent enough time to react. Same opponent, same tactic. Notice in the cut round, the hands stay quite high, so the crossguard protects the face. We also lean out slightly for additional safety. In this case, there's no counterattack, so we hit on both angles, first with the flex over, and then with the cut round as the opponent tries to parry. And a final example from the same sparring session, this one at a more relaxed pace, but still using the same set of techniques, attacking to the lower opening and leaning out for safety. So far, we've set up our target position, we've counterattacked with the flat, and we've cut around to the lower opening. The next two movements go together, a Furhow to the opposite side, or at least the threat of one, and then a flowing off action and a strike with the false edge to the upper right opening. Let's take a look at the Furhow first. We've attacked to the lower right opening, but despite keeping our guard high and leaning out, we're still very exposed on our own upper right opening. The most effective way to cover this is with a Furhow. Whether it hits or not is irrelevant. In fact, this is a really good example of the three types of attack in Meyer: the provoker, the taker, and the hitter. Now these are worth a video on their own, but very quickly a provoker provokes a reaction, a taker takes out the opponent's blade, and a hitter, well, it hits the opponent. A cut in Meyer, such as its Furhow, can be any one of these three things, depending on the context. Let's take a look at these in practice. First, the provoker, this time with a high Furhow. From our sequence of attacks, we provoke high, and as they go to parry, we cut around to the arms. And then of course we run away. In this case, we use the Furhow as a taker, and only just at the last minute. We cut in, we cut around, and we just get that Furhow-like action up high, just in time to protect ourselves. Finally, the Furhow as a hitter. In this case, we didn't make it all the way around to the low cut, so we attack in with the flat, we abandon the low cut, we parry, and then we use the final Furhow as a hitter, cutting short the entire action. Let's look now at the flowing off and the crossing over of the hands. Having performed our Furhow, whether we've hit or not, we flow off and we cross our hands like so. The false edge hits to the upper right opening on the right hand side of the opponent's sword. In effect, this is a kind of offside Furhow, and Meyer describes this kind of Furhow in his 1570 text, and also illustrates it in his other texts, as you can see here. The question is then, why don't we just use a Furhow instead of this strange kind of Furhow? And aside from because it's cool, there is another very good answer. We go through the standard opening sequence, with the flat, cutting around, and the Furhow. The opponent goes up to parry this, covering with the long edge and moving up to their high left. Now if we Furhow around to the other side at this point, it's very easy for them to parry. So what we're looking for is a technique which prevents this follow-up parry, and that's exactly what the Furhow does. By snapping around in a very steep near vertical angle, we actually glide down the opponent's blade as they attempt to parry, driving it out of the way and hopefully hitting them. Let's take a look at some examples in the wild. In this first example, it's a direct use of this Furhow-like action, displacing the blade and hitting with the point. In our second example, we have the flowing off, followed by this Furhow-like action. The weapon flows off and displaces the opponent's weapon, landing the point behind their blade. And finally, the same action, flowing off and landing behind their blade, and this time landing lightly with the edge. And finally, we reach the end of our sequence. We've come into the guard, we've hit with the flat, we've cut below, we've Furhowed round, we've flowed off and used the Furhow, and finally we use an additional Furhow to withdraw. Again, as a provoker, taker or hitter, this gives us the opportunity to move to a safe distance, where we can prepare for the next exchange. Now, having learned the entire play, we can reassemble it with variations on technique, timing, speed, footwork, and so on. The most important thing to remember when practicing Meyer's plays, however, is they're not necessarily intended to be executed from start to finish in actual combat. Each element of the play, as we've seen, conveys a very small lesson of its own, including its own tactical setup and series of outcomes. This is the way we should look at the plays from Meyer, not as an entire piece, but as a series of components which we can disassemble and reassemble as we see fit. And how do we best achieve this? Why, through constant practice with other fencers. After all, only the market can instruct the buyer. And there you have it. Thanks for watching.